Thanks so much for being with us today. It's a beautiful spring day, and a lot of people want to get started working in their gardens. So this is a perfect presentation for this time of year. And we're excited to have Mark Cohen with us again for the second program on regenerative agriculture. Mark is an Ohio organic farmer. He's an organic farm inspector for the state of Ohio. He's an ethnobotanist and an educator. After Mark left college in his 20s, he spent several years working with and living with indigenous communities in Belize. And he had already been interested in these topics, but those connections helped expand his awareness, knowledge, and appreciation of a new way to relate to community, agriculture, and the earth. Mark is on several boards. He's on the board of Agraria and the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions. He's on advisory boards for the United Plant Savers and Ecosystem Restoration Camps. We're grateful to have Mark here again with us to help us understand what we can do as home gardeners and as consumers to help restore and enhance health to ourselves, our communities, and to the planet. There's going to be plenty of time afterwards to ask questions. So if questions occur to you, please put them in the chat. And after Mark's presentation, we'll read questions to him. And also this talk is being recorded and it will be posted on the West Shore Fact YouTube channel. So you can review it there and also share it with people you think would be interested. So thanks again for being here, and thank you, Mark. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Yeah, hate to have you inside on such a beautiful day. Spring is just blasting outside my window. We've got peach trees and pear trees in full bloom right now. Apples are coming on. And the birds are just starting to migrate through. The first 2 or 3 species of warblers are here already, and it's just every day is a new experience with all the wildflowers coming up, and soon morel mushrooms and so forth. But yeah, I will continue from where we left off last time. Last talk was more of a global picture and understanding how we need to fit in what we do in with these larger communities of regenerative attempts around the world to put them all together so that we're not operating separately and kind of reinventing wheels. So I guess I'd like to start today in the most inclusive possible way, and I think what I'll focus on initially is kitchen skills. I've been thinking about it, like what happens in our kitchens really determines to a large degree what we go out and locate in terms of ingredients for dishes, and we, you know, it's an experimental place where we can put together the things that we really enjoy, and feeding family and friends and building community. I guess I've been thinking about this because number one, it should include everybody, but 2, really the biggest effect we're probably having in the world is what we're accessing through the marketplace. I mean, we're going to talk plenty about gardening and farming, which I do a lot, but really most of what that goes through our hands and stomachs and so forth are coming from, you know, generally far away and out of mind. And so I'd like to look at the kitchen skills, not only to be able to produce food and the normal things we think about, but also to preserve food and also making medicines, teas and tinctures and salves and things like that. So it becomes a real generator point in our homes for how we're interacting with the rest of the world. And I think that the tools that are required are very good because they're going to set you up nicely for moving this further into gardens and producing our own things. But long before that point, we can be building those skill sets to be able to put together nutritionally, healthy food for those that we care about, but also to be able to share the excesses of what we do have at any given moment. And so I just wanted to mention that because I think a lot of times I tend to start with gardening and farming, and it might seem like a lot of people aren't included in that. So, some of the things that we're talking about, other than just standard cooking, baking, etc., are also the fermented foods and canning, freezing, drying, a whole range and actually fermentation fits into that storage piece, which is a very large part of what we need to be thinking about. And we'll talk more about storage. So there's storage is going to come into play with not only with food, but water and energy, and just about anything we need to carry ourselves from an abundant. Generally, what you find is that everybody's got tomatoes in the summertime, and then nobody has fresh tomatoes later on in the year. There's ways that you can keep those abundances. Same thing with the sunlight. If you have batteries, you can capture that energy at home. Now, the general theme that I want to be looking at is to be regenerating the important metrics of what we're doing, which is gonna be roughly, it's gonna be centered on soil health, really, because soil health is gonna be determining to a lot of degree what kind of water resources we have and the quality of our water. And we can look at some metrics like water infiltration rates. Like if you watch what's happening in a rain in your yard or any piece of land you're taking care of, what you want to see is a rapid infiltration, that it's being drawn into the soil and then stored there. And we can talk also about water catchment of wetlands and water gardens, rain gardens, ponds, swales, all the different strategies to slow that water down and to keep it around longer. And if collectively we do this on a grand scale, like on a watershed scale, it makes a massive difference in regional microclimate management and access to water in droughts and so forth. So I know we talked last time about kind of bigger picture fields, but these things all apply in our backyards. And so in order to be inclusive about whatever we have in terms of lawns, yards, maybe some attached woodlots, things like that, we're really looking at, if you start to include the wild foods, for example, a lot of what we know as weeds are highly nutritious. And interestingly, they haven't been messed with very much in the sense of breeding and selecting. And so a lot of the nutrient density in wild plants is very high compared to agricultural foods. So if we're looking to harvest food from the whole landscape, and that can also include the wetlands and watersheds, riparian zones. We can plant a lot of trees if people have properties that are along streams, that'll enhance the quality of that watershed and the health of that ecosystem, but at the same time be producing a wide range of human needs. And so what we want to do is have everything have multiple functions as much as possible. And that's the beauty of it, because a lot of these plants are so clearly in the medicinal and food categories, but as well, they're soil builders. Each plant has got unique aspects to it that can mine minerals from deeper in the soil. If they've got deeper roots, they've got different microbial symbionts so that they can make accessible all sorts of minerals and biological byproducts of the biome, so that as we're building these healthy soils, not only are we growing more nutrient dense food, not only are we storing more water, because for every 1% of organic matter in our soil testing, we're getting 28,000 gallons of water storage per acre. Now, on a small scale, that's going to seem a lot less, but it's still, you can raise that five percentage points with composting and many different ways of increasing that organic matter. We can talk about biochar as well, things that we can be doing while we're cooking our food, for example, and then be banking that in the soil. So if you think about the soil as a bank, we're banking minerals, we're banking biology, we're banking like there's a seed bank in the soil. A lot of times we see that in the form of weeds, but seeds are stored in the soil for long periods of time. And weeds are generally something that the land is trying to rebalance itself. When you see a flush of plants growing, even though we see them as something we don't want, there's very often a real strategy there in terms of, they're hyper accumulators of many different types of minerals that are missing in those damaged soils. If people have been messing with them, they're generally more damaged than not. And so we have to change our thinking about what weeds are. And in some ways, weeds are just, somebody has a perception of a weed, it just means they haven't been in that place long enough to know what that plant is used for. And so almost everything has many, many uses. So as we essentially start with a landscape beyond the idea of all the things in the kitchen, I'm happy to talk about many of those if their questions are there. But as soon as you have some piece of ground, I mean, I guess I would start with just potted plants in your windowsill in the kitchen and focus on culinary herbs and cut and come again greens, things like parsley, kale, lettuces. Those kinds of things are very easy to do on a small scale. And then as we radiate that out into ground and look at our whole landscape, some of the first things you want to do is really try to shade every bit of soil and actually shade all the surfaces, because this is how we can participate in this global process of mitigating climate extremes, because all of the problems with climate really wind up being hydrological in nature. Flooding, droughts, and fires particularly, and really intense storms. And those are all collectively being thrown out of balance by our interaction with landscapes. And as I mentioned earlier, mostly things we're buying in the marketplace. So a few of the first things we have to do to begin to be able to regenerate anything is to cover it. And plant cover is the ideal because they have living roots in the soil and they evapotranspirate, so they cool surfaces. We can get very strategic about how we create microclimates. If it's a very hot, exposed place, we can create shade and microclimate where it's cool and moist in a number of different ways here. We can capture that water, we can sink that water, and such. So you want to cover it. You want to cover it as diversely as possible with as many species as possible. You want to shade roofs, parking lots, roads, any surfaces, any man-made disturbances where sunlight is hitting a bare surface, and we want to intervene with that. Luckily, we can do that in a way where it's giving us back fruit and wood, fuel, etc., and building soil the whole time. So a lot of these trees are producing leaves and branches and things, and we can utilize that in a number of different ways in the compost pile. So all of our kitchen scraps should be going through some kind of composting process. And in nature, that composting process is very much involved in going through animal digestive systems. They're basically compost systems on not wheels but legs, or what it may sometimes not, in the form of an earthworm, say. So we can look at earthworm beds for the more smaller urban type model. Poultry is excellent for small scale systems, and it really accelerates the decomposition and the transformation of plant material as it moves toward humus and compost and organic matter that's healthy for the soil. Um, the other thing is that those living roots are exuding liquid carbon. So we're building underground carbon by having healthy plants. And those plants can be really enhanced in terms of the degree of exudates that they're producing. For example, if you have a cover crop on a garden over the winter, or just have cover crop mixes in the growing season, and you're growing between them, tomatoes, for example, can be spaced pretty far apart, so you can have living mulches, but those ground covers are doing a tremendous amount of soil building and sequestering carbon. And so we want to have a longer growing season also, where there's a living root in the soil as long as possible in whatever growing season you have. So these are ways of stretching the effects out. And so if you've got, some of these hardy winter cover crops, you can have things like Austrian winter pea in a mix in the garden, where you can be harvesting pea shoots that are delicious in the middle of winter, but they're also sequestering some carbon, even in the colder times. So depending on the hardiness. So as we begin to build out the diversity in these landscapes, they start becoming ingredients for teas and tinctures, as well as food products. And we can be drying herbs and greens, fermentation, all those things I mentioned. And so a lot of the thinking that we need to also develop is to be communicating with our neighbors and developing, especially in the small garden situations where you don't have a lot of garden to work with. There's kind of an imperative to put together community gardens and places where people can interact, where we can kind of communicate about what we have in terms of seed varieties and knowledge of what is really good in which dishes and so forth. They turn out to be very powerful cultural tools. As you look at the effects of farmers markets and just marketplaces, traditional marketplaces all over the world, there's an exchange of information about what's being grown, as well as an exchange of ingredients, and then the exchange of the seeds and the cuttings and plant material to propagate those things. It winds up being a big factor in which plants make it through that process and which ones don't. So you're going to have gardens, you're going to have shade trees, you're going to have a lot of different types of places within these landscapes. Small ponds, that water storage can be used for irrigation later. It can be also potentially used to grow things like watercress and even water chestnuts. I saw some water chestnuts growing in North Carolina, just in an old sink in a garden, and they were delicious. So there's a lot of plants that we probably don't even think about that we could be growing. And so I would recommend a book, I might have mentioned it in my last talk, called Cornucopia by Stephen Fasciola. There's a tremendous variety of food plants, what parts of the world they come from, and then where you can get them. So, there turns out to be a lot of places that you can match up the altitude and the latitudes and the rainfall and the soil types in parts of China and other places around the world, where they're growing a lot of useful plants that we've never heard of. And so, these are our yards and gardens are places of experimentation. And so we should be trying lots of new things and then sharing what works. I've been just discovering lots of new plants lately. It's a friend down in North Carolina who's got a major collection of adaptogenic vegetables. I mean, they're herbs that grow in the forest for the most part, but some will grow. They often have cousins, like, say, the wood nettle in the forest is an excellent edible plant, and its wild cousin, the stinging nettle, is maybe the most nutritious plant on the planet, and it grows prolifically. I put in a bed last year, and it's like doubled in size now, and it's ready to be picking lots of food already this early in the year. So these wild foods are very important because they have a lot of compounds that are acting on our immune systems as well as nutritional um, systems. Um, so healthy soil comes in a lot of different ways. Let me back up and just look at that for a minute. Depending on where you are, it doesn't really matter where you are. I think what you tend to want to do is do a soil test initially and look at the basic mineral composition of your soils. It'll give you a reading on your organic matter, a kind of a baseline. It'll give you information that into the future you'll be able to go back and see that what you did is improving that soil. Um, Most likely, it could go the other way, but you need to know that too. And so, you're going to have a baseline by which you can see going forward what where you started and where you are at a given point. So, where that basically comes out, those soil tests don't tell you a lot about biology, really. Some tools are emerging where we can start to measure that. But initially, you'll want to look at a set of mineral balancing criteria that's been developed, and there's some differences of opinion, but usually it's kind of getting closer and closer to agreement. Um, but I would recommend Logan Labs in Ohio. I'm guessing most people listening to this are going to be in Ohio, and they balance. They'll give you recommendations and things like that. That's based on Albrecht's work. He wrote a number of books on mineral balancing. And the idea there is that you're creating a balance of minerals that work together and are conducive to microbial life. So the long game is really about microbial diversity. And so a lot of times people get stuck on the chemistry of a soil test. It's important initially, but as you get more and more biology in your system, you can actually transcend things that look like a problem on paper, but really are not a problem in the field. And that's because the biology mitigates a lot of imbalances, even things like pH, and some basic things like that. But we could talk a whole bunch. I guess I would also recommend, I'm working with this organization called the Bionutrient Food Association. Bionutrient.org is the website. And there's a stunning amount of really good information on that website. In particular, there's a 2-day course that my friend Dan Kittredge, who is the executive director of Bionutrient Food Association, we've done a series of these courses. It's usually a 2-day course, and it's all available for free online. So watch those, and it'll give you a very good sense of how to start with your soil testing and what to do once you get it and so forth. And then there's lots of resources. I would recommend getting involved with that organization in any way you can support it, because this gives us another leverage point from whatever we're growing. We've seen up to, at the extreme, we've seen up to 200 times more of certain nutrients like flavonoids and polyphenols and antioxidants and things like that in some of the foods that are grown in really healthy soil. So on top of all the other values that we were mentioning about having, cleaning water, holding water, creating a microbiome that'll be making our gut microbiome healthier as we eat food and transfer some of that biology. But on top of all of that, there's then this nutrient density that comes with really healthy soil. And so if you're leveraging up to 200 times higher, of compounds that you're really after, the reason for eating are these nutrients. And so if you're getting that much more out of a highly developed healthy soil, which you can do on a small scale relatively quickly, and it's a lot harder to do on a broad scale in a way. So you have this leverage to create higher quality than anything that's available in the stores. We're just being able to tease this out because there's a new tool that has been under development within this organization that can measure these things really for the first time. And the early version of that tool is available. I'm not sure I'd recommend it unless you have like a scientific background. At this stage in the game, there will be a more easy to use tool. And in the meantime, there's a simple tool for about $65, which is a bricks meter that you can test the bricks of your not only the finished food plant, but you can test the sap and of the leaf. You can squeeze sap from a leaf from a plant as it's developing to see. You can be able to read a lot of things about what's happening with that plant. You can very quickly see whether it's going to be vulnerable to insects or diseases, for example, because that stuff just drops away as you get up above about 12 on it's called a refractometer. They're pretty easy to come by. They have them on that website as well. So the nutrient density plays in very largely into our health. And if you look at the average person, average American, and the amount of time and money they spend on health issues, you would pretty quickly see that healthy food would be the best possible investment in your health. And food has always been the foundation of health, and the degree that which it's not up to speed is directly the degree that you'll see a breakdown in human health. So, some of the work of like Francis Pottinger, there's a recent book about him. He was back, I believe, in the 40s and 50s. He did a lot of work on intergenerational nutrition. He was doing experiments with animals and showing a degradation over time with certain types of diets. And so it's a fascinating territory. We don't have time to go too much into it now, but it's absolutely a major factor in I think the two biggest bottlenecks right now is human health and quality food. I think it's very hard to get quality food. Some of the studies that have been done on food that left the farm as a high quality product wound up being very compromised in as little as 24 hours. So the shipping of food all around the world is a problem, not just for the quality of food if you get it at the end, but the amount of wastage involved, the amount of energy, the upkeep of roads. So if we're really looking at being regenerative, we're going to want to shorten the supply chains as much as we possibly can. So that will automatically mean producing as much as you can yourself, but also sourcing from community gardens and CSAs and building community and looking at what's available in your area and working together as a group for a food security system. There's a lot of foods that last better than others, but some things really need to be fresh. So then this takes us to the other species in the landscape to some degree. We really want to optimize for pollinators. We want to optimize for insect diversity so that we're going to have insects and birds that will eat, pest insects and so forth. So if you get the minerals balanced, you get the biology going, you can get that plant sap up to say a 12 ideally. You're not going to have a whole lot of insects because really the insects are telling you that you failed as a gardener, unfortunately, because they literally cannot digest the secondary compounds of a healthy plant. The plants are built to protect themselves, and it's only the plants that are weakened by a lack of minerals and biology and some other conditions, a lack of water a lot of times. Water and air are things that are so obvious and yet people jump to conclusions like they need fertilizer or something when all they really need is water. Water changes the electrical conductivity of the soil and the access to a lot of the minerals, as well as the obvious need for hydration. So providing water is not only storage in the soil and the organic matter, but it's also mulching, drip irrigation, swale systems, as I mentioned before, about capturing water in place, capturing it into drums and ponds so you can irrigate later. There's some advanced systems out there that came out of Australia because they have really extreme dry 3 months of the year where everything basically dies if you don't have a strategy. And and we can extrapolate from some of those dry methods. Even in our desert Southwest, there's a lot of techniques that the native peoples had with like the Zuni waffle gardens and um, other strategies. Now we're in pretty good shape here in Ohio. We generally can, to a very large degree, rely on rainfall, especially as you get your soil up to a healthier state. Um, and so we're going to be looking at diversifying these plants in the landscape to where, we have the pollinators and the bird species, a lot of plants that have multiple values. They might be medicinal, but they also produce nectar, and they'll also produce fruit for birds and winter um, habitat, things like that. So there's a lot of interesting and increasingly complex ecological relationships as you increase diversity. Diversity really can't be overemphasized. It's really, it's very largely the reason why we've degraded so many landscapes historically. And it's also the ticket to be able to regenerate them, which is really what is most relevant at this point. No amount of hand wringing is going to change what we've lost, but we can create habitat where as many species as possible can thrive in the same landscape that we are. And so somewhere along the way, we started sharing less and less of our landscapes with other species, and it came back to bite us. Um, and so when you start looking at the phenology, which is the fruiting and flowering sequence during the year, you're going to find you can map out, when you have nectar. Say if you have bees, bees are something you can do in an urban setting, either on a roof or in some part of that landscape where the flight path of the bees isn't, going to be hitting the sidewalk or something where your neighbors are, and so forth. But the bees are interesting window into the floral diversity around you. As a beekeeper, you wind up seeing what kind of pollen they're bringing in every day, and what flowers they're working, and so forth. But the native pollinators are really important, and the honeybees have actually had historically a negative effect on the native pollinators. So a lot of the plants that we might grow for perennial flowers, and a lot of these medicinal plants are really good to have for these native pollinators as well as the honeybees. So quite a bit of what we would tend to be talking about at any scale is how do you restore ecological functions. So you're going to have all these different aspects of any given ecology, and you're going to have things like pollination, you're going to have nitrogen fixation, you're going to have so nitrogen fixation, for example, you can build into your garden with leguminous species in your cover crops or living mulches. You could have trees that are planted that are fixing nitrogen, that you're harvesting the shoots and off the top, so that the tree stays small and doesn't take all your sunlight, but it does share some of the nitrogen and the microbial um, ecosystem that's adjacent to some of your other food plants. A lot of the crop mixing crops, and the classic is corn, bean, and squash, the three sisters in native agriculture, where they all do different things. And the beans are in there are a legume, and the squash is like a ground cover that maintains moisture levels, and the corn gets up higher and provides structure for a climbing bean, say. Those kinds of symbioses are just rampant in the natural world. And so a lot of this is really about connecting. A lot of what we're regenerating is our own relationship to the places we live, to the plants, animals, insects, water cycles, etc. And so by spending quiet time at home, and there's a lot more in gardening than just producing some ingredients. There's a lot of our neural network that gets activated. Our gut microbiome, they're identifying kind of aspects of that are key to happiness in soil microbes right now. And so, as we spend more time in the soil, we're changing our microbiomes, we're changing the gut to brain axis, and there's a lot of power in that. But a lot of what we're doing is really reactivating very, very old relationships that we've always had, and bringing these things back into a conscious relationship. Because really, we talk about community, and the base level community is the soil and animal communities. Underneath of the foundation of which then we can build human communities around those deeper relationships. Because without those deeper relationships, we don't really have a human community, or we have one that's very sick. And so, the amount of leverage that we have in taking things out of the global supply chain, no matter how well somebody's doing it, the amount of energy in that footprint is phenomenal. And so to be able to produce something locally or go out and pick it in the wild, in such a way where there's more next time, if you harvest certain plants at the right time of year when the seeds are on it, you can plant those seeds at the ideal time for them, and you'll have way more of those plants in the future than you did if you didn't go out and pick it. So a lot of what I think Native peoples understand is that their relationship to harvesting, not just plants, but fish and animals, and interacting with that food chain, was a regenerative practice going back a very, very long time. We seem to have created pretty violent stories that remove the, and I'm not saying there wasn't violence, but there are complex situations. But I feel like historically what I was told as a child about Indians were, that they were savages, and we were really missing the deep intelligence and the traditional environmental knowledge there, because I feel like we did such a terrible thing by stealing the land and the exterminating all these peoples, that we kind of almost had to see them as flawed in order to have less guilt or something. I feel like that particular whole territory has not really been embraced yet. Um, it's good to see the Black Lives Matter conversation happening, but underneath of that is this really big breach of our relationship to the Native peoples, pretty much all over the world. Because our products, our ingredients, our economic reach goes out all over the world. It's not about just here. Um, so um, we would then we would kind of move into our easier things to grow. The things that you plant and you get multiple cuttings out of all season long, or you pick tomatoes, for over a long period of time. And these things can be selected for that longer season harvest as opposed to all at once. Now, if you want a tomato to come on all at once and you want a whole bunch to can, then you can get a determinate variety of tomato like the Roma. But a lot of the heirloom tomatoes that we think about, the big slicers, are most often indeterminate, and they'll keep producing as long as the soil and the conditions, the wilts and things don't take them out. So you can radiate out from your back door from a more intensive management, like fully sheet mulched. If you're going to have fruit trees, it would tend to be dwarf fruit trees, berries. There's a wide range of perennials that produce edible fruit. Again, many of which we haven't really, explored very much, like aronia, and there's wild, well, not wild, but hardy kiwis. I've been growing those, and they're very, very nice to have in the landscape. They're a little more like a grape than a fuzzy kiwi. They're smaller. They're about 50% sweeter. Like I said, there's just a gold mine of plants out there to build relationships with, and then over time, they become part of your annual cycle and your diet and what you eat in the winter, and jams and teas and so forth. Um, let's see here. Let me just take a quick look at some of my notes. Talked a little bit about storage. That becomes important. Um, Let me just mention this idea, which I talked about last time, which is the biochar. The carbon in the soil is very hard to keep around in general, especially if you're exposing it in the hot time of the year. So we've been playing around with biochar largely because it was it was such an incredible.
And then extra shield, that'll be $8 today.
Anyway, sorry. I was referring to the terra preta soils of the Amazon, which impressed me so deeply because it's such a difficult thing to make black, rich soil in a place that's really hot and oxidizing carbon as fast as you can grow it just about. And the key to that was that the native people in the Amazon were making charcoal at a broad scale, and it was accumulating over time. And really that's, when we talk about regenerative, it's really about setting up a system that mimics natural systems abilities to accumulate the important aspects, and soil carbon is one of those important aspects. It's also important to accumulate genetic information that's adapting to the place where you are. So there's a lot of selection in our seed choices, and then what we choose, we then select which ones make it, and the way we select which plants to save for seed winds up being changing very much the availability of adapted plants for future generations. And so there's almost an endless amount of work to be done in that area. But the charcoal piece, we've been finding, maybe another time I can walk around with the phone and show you some things. But I've got about 3 or 4 different types of cookers that can cook food using any kind of dry biomass, and it'll make charcoal while it's cooking. So you can cook your meal and then have this charcoal that goes into a compost, and that part of that carbon is even more durable than the other organic matter in the compost. So this is also something that can be done on a small scale. I've got I know it's tricky to have an outdoor burn in the city, but if you're allowed to have a little fire pit, even, you can easily make about 4 5-gallon buckets in one evening, and that's after you've already cooked some. You could have a bunch of neighbors over and cook food, and then have charcoal if you know when to put it out. I've also got some much smaller ones, a camp stove that you can take anywhere with a very small amount of wood. You can cook your food while camping, and if you dump those hot coals into a bucket of water at the right moment, you have charcoal, and you've locked it into a form that can be used for not just for in the soil, as we mentioned, which is a massive important thing, but also for filtering water. You can use it to filter air. You can use it to protect your water sources in a landscape. You can put them on contour in socks or in other different ways. Just put it in a swale, and the water passing through that will be cleaned of a lot of what otherwise would be pollutants. So and also you can actually use that as a fuel as well. I'm going to be adapting a 12 horsepower Gravely tractor this summer to run on charcoal, which is a byproduct of my electrical energy system, hot water system in the wintertime. And so you get so many things out of just, say, pruning your apple trees, or thinning the leguminous trees like black locust in a landscape, and thinning them, and using that wood to get cooking done, space heating, electricity, season extension in a greenhouse, and then end up with this byproduct of thousands of years of soil carbon. So we're trying to hit as many things simultaneously as we can, so that we get 8 things done with every single act. That's a key to accumulating over time rather than just kind of spinning our wheels. You know, if you can get access to long-term land tenure, then you get around that endless need to pay rent. You know, it's a similar kind of thing. You got to think your way out of this, otherwise you're just constantly spinning your wheels in the mud. But if you do this right, the soils. It was interesting. A while back, I did these soil tests on my garden that I've been gardening for over 40 years, and I tested that versus just a test out in a field that I hadn't really been using, but the same soil that my garden started off as, when I first moved here. And I saw just amazing differences in all aspects of the balance of that soil health. And to have that be a byproduct of having been fed for 40 years out of it felt really good. And I think we've barely gotten started on how to accomplish this. But, part of it, like I mentioned, is in just running all this material we have access to, and we rake leaves or take compost out from the kitchen and put that through a process that ends up back in the soil, feeding it. And so what you're doing is you're closing loops. There really shouldn't be anything but closed loops as there is in nature, but humans have waste. The concept of waste is I would say it's a sickness. But you can also just say it's incomplete design, because if you have waste, somebody didn't design properly, and that should have been fed back into another process that fed something else. And everything can be seen that way. Even the CO2 in our atmosphere is essentially a feedstock for photosynthesis. So, we don't have to be seeing something as a problem necessarily. We can be seeing it as an opportunity to get it right. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of community building around all of this, and it seems like historically humans have always gotten together. They've gathered for feasts. They've gathered for a lot of different purposes. When you say building a new house or a barn raising or planting of a large field in communities all over the world, there's a lot of things that come together there that I think the average modern person is really lacking in the sense that the compounds in our bloodstreams that we're seeking, and I would argue that this is really what's underneath of addiction issues, because addiction to compounds, even things like sugar, but all of the more commonly talked about addictions are usually giving a short boost of a chemical type boost that was previously achieved through feeling good in a community setting. And you can break these down into things like serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, human growth hormone, and I think that when we're lacking those things, and I don't think they're just purely between people either. I think that the encounters and being at peace with other species, birds, animals, and insects, is part of this larger set of well-being experiences that we've had from the very beginning. And to the degree that we've been isolated from these relationships, there's this need, and that need is often gotten in a cheap, shortcut way through addiction type relationships. And there's a lot of eating disorders that are kind of can be explained this way as well. But if your body is seeking certain nutrients, desperately, and you're eating foods that are processed and have not only the lack of the things that you need, but a whole bunch of things that you really don't need in terms of food colorings and preservatives and such, you're really kind of going backwards. And that short little burst of a feeling of being satiated or something is then followed by a real deeper hunger for what you were originally after. So there's a lot of philosophical things to discuss here about that, and what's driving the weakness of the material-based society, and the very energy and wealth centered reality of a smaller and smaller group of people controlling the wealth of everyone else is pretty horrendous, but it's also points to, all the subtle ways that we enable that. And we can take, and how the more important story is how we can take that back piece by piece. And a lot of these simple things that happen in our kitchen and our backyards are way more powerful than we would have normally ever thought when you look at the aggregation of people's habits. So I don't know how close we are to questions, but we might cycle into some questions if they're accumulating. Otherwise, I can go off on some other territory. But that's there's a few things I didn't mention. I guess one is that Korean natural farming is quite interesting. A lot of the plant material can be made into products that are used in the garden, things like fermented plant material. It's just something I would recommend having a look at. It's an interesting territory because you make all your own fertilizers, and they're all microbially very rich or stimulating of rich microbial systems. And you can go out and partially cook rice, for example, and put it out under the oldest tree that you know of, in that black rich leaf mold, and then the species will migrate from that old tree soil into your rice, and then you add brown sugar to that in one cycle for about another week, and you take some of the liquid of that and you put it into bran, and then that grows into the bran, and you're basically making a series of these cultures that builds a specific type of compost. And people are having very good results with that. There's also fermented fruit juices and fermented hyperaccumulator plants, things like comfrey and nettles, and these kinds of plants are very powerful, not only for us to eat and use as medicine, but to create products that we can use in the garden for a whole range, almost every need. One example would be toasting your eggshells in the oven and then breaking them up and adding apple cider vinegar. And in the reaction of acid in the vinegar with calcium carbonate, you get the foaming and the bubbling. And when that balances itself out, the calcium in the eggshell goes into the liquid, and that can be diluted at about 500 to 1 and sprayed on, say, tomato plants if you have blossom end rot. If you've ever seen some tomatoes where the bottom kind of turns brown and it's called blossom end rot, that's a calcium deficiency. You can do the same thing with bones, from soup bones, put them in the oven and then break them up and put them in vinegar and do the same thing. And what you're going to get there is calcium and phosphorus. So any plant at any time that goes into flower, their needs for phosphorus go through the roof. And so you can do a diluted spray of that and give those plants exactly what they need when they need it, and get massive traction in that plant's ability to thrive in real time. You can also get huge results by foliar feeding, with a series of minerals and things like seaweed and fish emulsion and some of these compost teas and biological brews that we could get into. And you can see a 5-fold increase in root growth and some of the root exudates, again, that are feeding the soil. So the microbes that in the soil are coming from largely from a combination of minerals and the exudates from plants that they're translating into this microbiome. And it's endlessly complex and interesting to study. I would highly recommend reading anything you can by Kristen Jones out of Australia. Elaine Ingham's work is worth looking at for sure. Quite a few others. I mean, we could put together a resource base on this, but again, you're going to find all of that with that one website that I mentioned earlier, on the bionutrient.org. So, should we check a few questions?
Yeah, we do. I'm gonna ask some of the questions that are here. I'm sorry, that have been posted before the ones that are in the chat. So the first question is, please give a few examples of highly nutritious weeds that are fairly common, so are easily gettable. Like you mentioned, stinging nettle. Or what else would you?
Dandelions, like everybody's got, is an astoundingly powerful plant for a bunch of reasons. But you can go on YouTube and look at, pretty quickly get up to speed on what some of these plants can bring. It really depends on what time of the year, on what's out there. But things like chickweed and violets and there's a world of good plants. Now, I guess you have to be mindful up around where you are because of being on roadsides and things like that. You're going to get some contamination, but I would bet that the positives are going to be much more than the negatives, versus not eating them. But those are a few. The red buds are starting to bloom right now. Those flowers are great in salads. The wild ramps are up in the woods. Those are excellent. Boy, there's so many. I mean, there's edible plants of Eastern North America, I believe, is a good resource to look at what's out there. And then there's a lot of things you can plant in that aren't native, but are somewhat wild. I mean, there's this really interesting plant called Jiao Gulin. It's a Chinese adaptogenic plant. It's in the Cucurbitaceae family, which is squash and cucumbers family. And it has 5 of the ginsenosides of ginseng in it, and it has edible leaves. It grows in a semi-shade. It grows, like in a woods even. And you can just constantly grab armfuls of it and be eating it in salads, juices, teas. Amazing phytonutrients in these plants. Things like pigweed, and you can go back into the Eastern agricultural complex in this region from here over to the Ozarks, and look at what people were eating, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and you're going to find the chenopodiums, the lamb's quarters. These are highly nutritious plants. Lamb's quarters has extreme nutrition levels. Anyway, lots of good stuff there.
Okay. All right. Next question is, you talked about the relationship between animals and plants and how they help each other. Do you feel that there is a benefit to animals like birds and squirrels and groundhogs and deer in your garden?
Yes, but deer can be a real problem. I personally decide to fill my freezer with venison instead of going to the store for meat. And that's after having generally kept them out with fencing, but you get sneaky ones that will jump your fences, and that turns into a selection to go into the freezer for my system. But there's no question about it that animals, I'm not even sure it's possible to do regenerative agriculture without animals. And this is really why I think the work of Reginaldo Hezlet Marroquin is so brilliant, because he's using poultry as an example of what can be applied in most places, because a lot of places people can't do cows or can't do larger animals. But when you look at what really happens in the gut of a cow, for example, with 6 stomachs, I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal what changes in the plant material. And so if you just try to break that plant material down without animals, you're waiting longer and you're getting a less complex outcome. So yes, having started off in wildlife biology, I thrive on bird diversity, I thrive on insect diversity, I thrive on animal diversity, and then it's a matter of just figuring out how to protect the things that you need to protect in that landscape with fences and dogs and other things. The difficulty with getting really healthy soil is that what you find is that your insects and diseases are much less of a problem, but the animals become way more of a problem because they know you can use them as indicators instead of using measurement tools. The degree that animals are coming after your plants is a function of nutrition, whereas insects and diseases is a function of sickness in the plant. Right, so the insects and the diseases are kind of the garbage men of the system. They're telling you have garbage. They're going to take it out and they're going to turn it into compost and bring it back to something better. But animals go the other way. As you get more and more healthy human food, the animals are going to want it more and more for the same reason. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to through the years on many different farms that tell me that they watch the deer go around the GMO corn, they go around the chemical corn, and they come over to the organic corn like every time. And I don't even ask them about that. They tell me independently over and over again, to where after a while you extrapolate, but you see it yourself as well. And I think it's a reason why a lot of children don't like vegetables, is because the vegetables are absolute crap. What we found with really good carrots or really good vegetables, that the kids can't stop eating them. So again, if the insects are trying to eat our vegetables and the kids don't want it, you might want to look at that a little closer.
Yeah. That's actually a really good segue into the next question. So you talked a little bit about eating disorders and food that is not providing any nutritional value. Do you think that degraded soil has led to health issues among younger people who have grown up eating food produced only on big ag farms? And if you think there's a connection, what are some of the health issues that you have heard about or have seen?
Almost all of the health issues are hinged on that particular piece. I don't think there's any question these days that a reduced microbiome will reduce your ability to digest a lot of different types of foods. And also the work I mentioned about from Francis Pottinger's work on intergenerational, because it gets worse generation after generation up to a point of 3 or 4 generations. Definitely autoimmune diseases and so many of these things that are exploding right now are tied not only to the low nutrition and the lack of microbial diversity for their microbiome, but also a lot of the toxins that are in there, the heavy metals and the endocrine disruptors, and a lot of the plastic breakdown compounds. Yeah, you can have a field day talking to a very intelligent medical professional, someone like Zach Bush, for example, in Virginia, about all the causation and how it's changed, and what was the onset of certain diseases that we've seen it really explode, and how did that correlate with the onset of the use of glyphosate, for example. We know the history of when the amounts of these things and how much they were being used essentially on the public in a way that we had no protection whatsoever. I mean, Silent Spring came out, what was it, the 70s or something, and about the causing cancer of certain chemicals, pesticides, and things that cause cancer. Well, by the 90s, we were into a book called Our Stolen Future by Theo Colburn. She wrote a book about endocrine disruption and how prevalent it is and what you can expect to see when it happens. But a lot of the hormonal disruption that we're seeing young girls, and you see it all over the place once you start understanding what's happening, that the body has been reading the environment for hormone levels for a very long time, and all of a sudden at parts per billion and sometimes even parts per trillion, these chemicals that the body has never known looks an awful lot like a chemical that tells the body to develop before it's ready, because it thinks that certain pesticides are estrogen, for example. But it's a whole world I would recommend taking a look at. It's not good news. I mean, it's not going to be. It'll help your understanding, but it's depressing. You know, when you look at that in Silent Spring, these things that were weakening eagles' eggs and causing cancer in humans, that 2 orders of magnitude more diluted than that, it's wreaking havoc on our endocrine systems. And so all of those kind of things are happening with children these days. It's like their ability to digest, the number of allergies, the autoimmune diseases, the fact that 50% of all children have at least one chronic illness. I mean, this is free fall. That is really an extreme thing. The good news is that with good nutrition and cleansing and a number of different techniques, they can pretty much all be reversed. And even in more powerful ways than we used to think possible. There's a lot of interesting things emerging now about how to stimulate our own stem cells using food. And they generally tend to be whole foods that are not concentrated and processed, that and even using the whole plant in a lot of the herbal medicine, using every bit of that plant, because there's different levels of compounds that our bodies recognize in the different parts of the plant. So yeah, that's a complex. I'm not a medical professional, but I've spoken with enough of them, especially the functional medicine people like Mark Hyman at the Cleveland Clinic, and others, Zach Bush, as I mentioned, and that it's very clear connection between poor diet and health outcomes. But we're talking about the power of being able to really get much higher levels of nutrients, much cleaner ingredients, and be able to avoid those types of outcomes, or reverse them and then avoid them in the future.
All right, wonderful. Simpler question. Can you give an example of a dish that you can make using stinging nettle?
Yeah, I mean, anything that requires greens, you can steam them and put them into, anything you would have put, say, spinach in. So that could be a souffle or an omelet. It could be, numerous different ways to do that. But yeah, what you have to get savvy at handling stinging nettle. You don't do it with bare hands. I just saw somebody in Appalachia that had taken a pair of shears, and they put a couple pieces of aluminum onto the shears, so that when you're snipping the tops, it's being captured by the aluminum pieces on the shears, so you're not touching any of the hairs. But as soon as you blanch that with hot water, or throw it in a wok or something, you're going to knock out those compounds that are stinging.
Okay. Can you give another example of a symbiotic relationship like the three sisters?
In crops?
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of companion planting. It's somewhat complicated because the chemistry of these plants now seems to be even changing based on nutrition. I gave a talk last year at the Soil Nutrition Conference with a Guatemalan, the same fellow I mentioned earlier, Reginaldo, and he was talking about seeing changes in the landscape, which is kind of the opposite, but it's moving towards symbiosis from competition. And it's a very interesting subject, because what the idea here is that most people probably heard that you can't plant things underneath the black walnut. And what he found was that he had some indigenous pushback on cutting down these trees, these walnut trees. And what he found was that he was building a poultry system, and he was running enough chickens underneath of these trees to be able to give them an abundance of nutrients. And after a while, the walnut trees stopped producing the compounds that were allelopathic or poisoning to other plants because they didn't need to. They didn't need to compete. And you're going to see analogies in this in human behavior and other animal behavior, that when nutrients are in abundance, the competition and fighting and all the stuff that happens in a scarcity type scenario are transformed towards symbiosis. But there are a lot of examples in the natural world, pretty much everywhere. You have some interesting tropical examples I know from working in the tropics are this symbiotic relationship between ants and fungi that have learned to cultivate the mycelium of the fungi underground in gardens to feed the rest of their ant population. And it's gone so far that the fungi has really stopped making mushrooms or fruiting bodies. It depends on the ants to propagate its mycelium in these gardens. There's another one where there's an ant that lives on a tree that has hollow thorns, and it has these little sugar water. It's basically like little drinking fountains of sugar water on the plant, and so the plant provides the hollow thorns to live in, that the ants drill holes and live in, and then they feed on not only the sugar water, but these little Belgian bodies fruits. And they're not really fruits, but they're kind of edible size, bite-sized food for the ants. And in exchange, the ants completely protect the tree from anything that touches it, because that plant doesn't have the chemistry in the leaves to protect itself from other herbivores, but the ants will go after anything that tries to eat it, or even cut the vines off that try to climb up it. So, but really, the more you look at the natural world, you start to see that we sort of missed the profound amount of symbiotic relationships in the natural world, and we focused on competition and warfare. And when we see a problem, we go to war with it, the war on this and the war on that. And even, like, say, for cancer treatments, to a large degree, going after, having so much of the human body be negatively affected by the overspray of using chemotherapy compared to other methods that don't cause harm. You see it over and over again in agriculture, using the chemicals and the gases from World War II, from killing people to putting them to use to kill insects. And the fertilizers from the bomb grade materials, these were just really a direct flow of war into our food system. And so we really need to understand what the basis of symbiosis is, because it's really everything that we know, even real basic things are coming out of a symbiotic set of relationships. Some of the earliest soil building, the convergence of fungi and photosynthetic abilities in lichens, for example, and what that allowed in terms of transforming rock minerals and such is very interesting. There was a book called Microcosmos that really kind of is proposing that so much more of what we see in evolution is symbiotic than survival of the fittest type thinking. And in that book, she was proposing that even the microbes that were eating other microbes eventually led toward a symbiotic relationship that formed the basis of mitochondria in cell formation. So it looks like from her perspective and from many others, the more you look at biology, that aggression stimulates a response of cooperation and symbiosis, and that the response of cooperation against aggression has a longer survival value in the evolutionary game than the aggression did. And so, maybe that's a biological way of saying the meek shall inherit the earth. I don't know, but it's very clear that these group strategies, when you look at, flocks of birds that flock together for their own protection, it's not just one species. They're doing it together, and you look at the incredible coordination, of birds and other insects and animals that follow army ants in the jungle floor, and how they all interact in that food gathering situation. You see it in the ocean with whales and other species, and there's a lot of cooperation going on out there. And I think that we got overly beat up by the strongest survives kind of idea. And I think accurately it would be more the survival of the fittest communities rather than the fittest individuals. So,
Okay.
yeah,
All right,
symbiosis.
all right. Thank you. So, moving back to the longer growing season, you talked about heirloom tomatoes having being more indeterminate in their growth. Are there other veggies that are indeterminate? And then
Well, there are heirlooms that are determinate and indeterminate, but I was just saying that I think when most people think of a slicing tomato and the heirloom tomatoes, that they tend to be these taller fruits that will keep bearing, as opposed to, all making fruit at once, that you pick them at once and they kind of die. But as far as determinate and indeterminate, I believe is pretty much of a tomato thing. In terms of that aspect of it, but there are so many other things that emerge within the heirlooms. Like heirlooms, we generally think of hybrids as having this hybrid vigor and are more vigorous than open pollinated varieties. And that people may not know what that means, but open pollinated means you can breed them, you can keep them cross to themselves, and they'll just keep making seed over and over again, whereas an F1 hybrid is going to revert to one of the parents. It's not going to come true. And so a lot of the hybrid seeds that you buy, you can't save the seeds from them and get the same results because they were crossed between two parent traits, and they only have that effect at the first generation. So you can select all over the place once you get into what's going on with, if you analyze our food system, we're looking at going from about at least 20,000 plant species to where 12 plants make up 90% of our food supply. So we've radically narrowed it down to a few annuals. When you look at, there's books like Sturdivant's Edible Plants of the World, and I mentioned that cornucopia book. To really look at what diversity could be, how much representation we could get into. But as far as determinant goes on that particular question, that's pretty much of a tomato thing.
Okay. Okay, hold on a second. I got this. So just a quick question. You mentioned eggshells and apple vinegar, then you mentioned bone and apple vinegar. Can this be cooked like bone that has been used for stock? Will that work the same way?
Yes, and you can also make bone char, which will retain some of the, basically a lot of the same properties of biochar, except it's bone, and they can be mixed as well. We had a large outdoor on wheels biochar making system, and we were able to use some of the deer from some of the slaughter facilities that were cleaning deer in the area after hunting season. We were mixing wood and deer bones to get some of those effects. But yes, so I had mentioned that you could take the bones out of your chicken soup or something and toast them in the oven. until they're really dry, and then pound them, grind them up a little bit, and use the vinegar system in order to extract the phosphorus and the calcium from that source. But yes, they could be cooked.
Okay, awesome. Can you spell that Chinese plant that you referred to?
Yeah, I believe it's JIA. That's Jiao Gulin, Gulin. I'd have to pull up the Latin name on it. Let's see if I can. It's an amazing plant. There's a guy down in North Carolina. If you go to Mountain Gardens, he has a whole lot of clips on YouTube that talk about all these plants, but he also has a seed collection. You can access seed from him. His name is Joe Hollis. But let me just see if I can pull up Jiao Gulin real quick while we're talking.
Okay. There are also questions about wood chips as mulch, whether that's a good mulch. A couple of people asking that.
Wood chips are a very good mulch. You just have to be mindful to not turn them under the soil, because they'll temporarily rob nitrogen when they're breaking down.
Oh,
So a good way to use them is in paths. If you have raised beds and you put the wood chips in the pathways, and then in alternate years you could do that for a couple of years or 1 year, and then flip the soil from the bed onto the pathway so that the old wood chips are now underneath. But there's also like fresh green wood chips, which they call ramial chips. And they've got, especially in the spring, in the new spring green growth, chipped up has got special powers in mulching and composting. So this Jiao Gulin plant is Gynostemma pentaphyllum. It's looks like here it's all one word, JIAO GULAN.
okay. All right, thank you. I think this might be, well, almost the last question. And just going to read, this is Kim is asking this, but although Kim, I don't know how to pronounce all of these terms, but I'll try. I've tried, are you saying bakchi? Fermented compost.
Bokashi.
Oh, bokashi, fermented compost after making bran with bottled EM. I'm really struggling with this, but
yeah. So EM is effective microorganisms. It's a Asian system of kind of making some of these microbial compounds that they use in different ways. But keep going.
So she said that she's heard that it's better to use locally cultured microorganisms. Can you talk a little bit more about how to harvest these? Also, what should I do with a bokashi liquid? I think it's really acidic, so maybe it shouldn't be put on the garden. Oh, with a question mark.
I'm not sure if it's that acidic. You could always just put it back into the composting process, would be just fine. Yes, there's a conversation about trying to use. I think those EM species are are going to give you benefit. But if you do want to not only be in control and not have to put out money and things like that, you can do some of these techniques, as I mentioned, with the rice in the Korean natural farming, which is also, what do they call it? Indigenous microorganisms, IMOs. So what you tend to do is just get an eye for really healthy plants in the wild. It can be anywhere, but say it could be on the edge of a wetland, it could be in the forest, it could be in a prairie, and you can bury these little, porous baskets of 3/4 cooked rice, roughly, and leave it there for a week, and then come back and take that rice, and then you feed it with sugar and go through those stages of basically making the IMO 1 and IMO 4 and all the stages in between. They're used in different ways, but that would be gathering local microbial communities close to you, like the closest old growth forest and the closest healthy ecosystem, and you'd be able to be building your own mixes from your own region. And there's pretty good reason to think that that's valuable.
Two other questions. This one is about biochar. You talked about like making your own biochar, and you said you have to take the wood out of the fire at the right moment. How do you know when that moment is, that you should douse it with water or put it out in one way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So because there's a massive opportunity if you're burning wood and you get it to that point when you're at coals and you go from coals to then ashes, that's where you miss the window, right? So one of the ways we make it is I've got these cookers, right? I've got one that's a cooker. I put bamboo or just small pieces of wood, and you light it, and it's a top lit updraft stove. And in that stove, it's pretty easy because when the flames go out, there's clean flames coming out of this thing, and when the flames go down and you look in there and there's just coals, it's ready to just take the top off and dump into a bucket and load it back up and start it again if you want to keep cooking. Another way that we do it is with 55-gallon drums, which is pretty effective, where you'd take like a 1-inch by 4-inch cut holes in the base of the 55-gallon drum, not in the bottom, but in the base, like four equally spaced 1x4 openings. Fill that whole 55-gallon drum full of wood, dry wood, and then you light it from the top with your smallest stuff at the top. And as that starts to burn, you put a second 55-gallon drum on top. And the second drum has no bottom and no top, so it's like a chimney. It extends the chimney of the burn, basically, and it'll start burning really clean. You're going to get a clean flame coming out of that, but very little to no smoke. And that'll take about 2 hours, and it'll burn down toward those holes in the bottom that I mentioned. And as you see a golden, glow at one of the holes, you take some loose soil and you cover up the hole with a shovel. And then the flame will go toward the other holes. It'll just move toward whatever fuel is left in there. And you get to the second one, you cover that one up. The third one, you cover that one up. And the fourth one, you cover that one up. And at that point, you're going to have a similar thing where there's no flames coming out. You take off the top drum, and then you look in there and it's going to be all just glowing coals. Then you put a lid. You keep the original 55-gallon drum lid with the clamp. It has clamps on it to clamp it shut. Obviously, you're using leather gloves because of the heat, but you clamp that shut and you starve the oxygen. You could pour water in it. You're going to tend to probably burn up your barrels a little faster with that material, but either way works. The one I also have one that's an outdoor fire pit. It's an inverted steel pyramid with the bottom roughly 12 inches cut off. So you got this opening of about a 12 by 12 opening that sits right in the soil. And then you build a fire in it. And you just keep throwing wood in all evening, as much as you have or can throw in there. And what happens is that the coals don't get enough oxygen to burn to ash. So you just keep building it up and it keeps building coals. At the end of the night, it's got a grill that swings over and you can cook your food over the coals and then pour buckets of water on it and put it out. So those are a couple different ways that depending on which way you're, with the small scale ways that I tend to use, those would be the ones you'd be looking at.
Okay, and then with that inverted pyramid, what's left on the bottom after you cooked your food and put the water on it, that's the biochar.
Yeah. Yep.
All right, it is 4:30. I think there are questions that I'm confident there are questions that I have not gotten to, but this is kind of our time limit. I don't know if you are available to stay longer. We should probably draw this to an end, but if you're available, if anybody wants to ask questions, just unmute yourself and ask. I don't know, Mark, if you're available for that.
Sure, I could be on a little longer if people have questions. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
You've
you're
got all
welcome.
kinds of compliments and thanks in the chat over here. So, you know, I'm very appreciative of your being here and spending this time. And if anybody wants to unmute themselves and just like talk a little bit or ask whatever questions I missed, feel free to do that. Unless you can everybody unmute themselves?
I put this in a comment. I don't know if you saw it, Mark, but just that you're such a font of fascinating, helpful information. Really, I mean, I'm taking notes like mad here today. So, thanks so much for addressing
Sure.
these things with us.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it's a large topic. I mean, I'm trying to kind of take on so many of these topics at once, but I think it's good to just you know, circulate these ideas and translate what's working in the larger ecosystem restoration projects out there, regenerative agriculture, and then apply them locally at a small scale, because that's really where most people are. So hopefully we got a reasonable start on that, but there's no real ending point.
Thank you.
Mark, I've identified purple dead nettle. It's all over my yard.
Yeah.
Have you ever eaten that, or I mean, or anything? I mean, is it good for anything?
Not that I know of. I mean, but that's just probably my own ignorance. That's one of those plants that seems to kind of take over, and it probably has some unique characteristics. There's some books out there. There's one called Weeds and What They Tell. I believe that's Pfeiffer. There's a few books like that that tell you what they mean in terms of your soil balance. You know, some plants are going to tell you that your soil is compacted. Some are going to say that you're low in potassium, things like that. So you'll be able to read some things from that, but I don't offhand know of a use for that plant.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Not
Thanks.
to say there isn't one.
Okay.
All right. Was there anything else anybody wanted to ask? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mark. I'm very grateful. We're very appreciative of the time and the extra time that you put into this. It was hugely informative, and we will have this posted on our YouTube channel, and we will have this video and the video from February on the Facebook page, as on our West Shore Fact Facebook page as well.
Okay, very
All right.
good.
Thanks, Mark.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome. Have a great spring day.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya. Thank you.